The bank's board of directors was not laughing by the time the old man was finished, but the loan officer was laughing when he first arrived. Arthur Jennings felt the laughter like a physical blow. It was a sharp, barking sound, full of youthful arrogance and utter disbelief. It echoed off the polished marble floors and the high, impersonal ceilings of the Sterling National Bank lobby. Every head turned. The tellers paused their counting. The customers in line shifted their weight, their eyes flicking from the impeccably dressed young loan officer to the quiet, gray-haired man standing before his desk. Arthur felt his own face grow warm, a slow, creeping heat of humiliation that started in his chest and spread to the tips of his ears. He clutched the handle of the worn, steel toolbox at his side, its familiar weight a small, cold anchor in a suddenly hostile sea. Trent, the loan officer, leaned back in his leather chair, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. His name was emblazoned on a polished brass plate on his desk. Trent Radcliffe, Vice President of Lending. He looked no older than 30. His suit was sharp, his hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes held the predatory gleam of a young man who had never known a day of genuine hardship. He gestured dismissively at the papers Arthur had carefully laid out on the desk. They were old, the edges yellowed with time, the typewritten font slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. "A 52-year pension claim?" Trent repeated, the laughter still in his voice. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a bank, not a history museum. We don't have records going back to the Paleolithic era." Arthur's throat felt tight. He had practiced what he would say, rehearsed the simple, factual explanation in his small apartment for weeks. But the words caught behind a knot of shame and anger. He had expected skepticism, perhaps confusion. He had not expected to be a spectacle. He had not expected to be mocked. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out softer than he intended. "It's a valid agreement. My father, Henry Jennings, was part of the original construction crew for this very building. There was a special arrangement." Trent picked up the top sheet of paper, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a soiled tissue. He squinted at it theatrically. "The Artisan's Endowment, signed by a Harold Sterling. The original Sterling, I presume? The founder?" He let out another short, derisive laugh. "Sir, Harold Sterling has been dead for 40 years. Whatever handshake deal he made with your father died with him. That's how the world works." The phrase hung in the air, thick with condescension. That's how the world works. A world where promises had expiration dates. A world where a man's life's work could be dismissed with a smirk. Arthur felt a flicker of the old anger, the same quiet, slow-burning fire his father had possessed. But he pushed it down. Not here, not now. His father had taught him patience above all else. Patience was a tool, just like a hammer or a level. You had to know when and how to use it. "It wasn't a handshake deal," Arthur said, his voice gaining a sliver of firmness. "It was a contract. It's legally binding. It was part of his compensation package, in lieu of a higher wage. It was meant to mature after 50 years of continuous bank operation." Trent dropped the paper onto his desk. The gesture was one of finality, of utter dismissal. He began tidying the other documents into a messy pile, preparing to hand them back. "Look, Mr. Jennings, I'm sure this is all very important to you, sentimental value and all that. But the bank's current pension system is managed by a third-party firm. It's all digitized. If you're not in that system, you don't exist. There's no dusty old ledger in a basement where we're going to find your father's name next to a pot of gold." He pushed the papers across the desk toward Arthur. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do for you. We deal in real assets here, not stories. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have clients with actual appointments." He pointedly looked past Arthur to the next couple waiting in the queue, offering them an apologetic smile that was all teeth. The message was clear. The joke was over, and the jester was being dismissed. Arthur stood there for a moment, the blood pounding in his ears. The eyes of everyone in the lobby were on him. He saw pity in some, amusement in others. He was just a confused old man, a relic clutching at a fantasy. He slowly gathered the papers, his hands trembling slightly. He made sure each page was perfectly aligned before he slid them back into the worn manila folder. He did not look at Trent again. He did not want to see the triumph in the young man's eyes. He picked up his toolbox. The cold, heavy steel felt good in his hand. Solid. Real. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. He turned and walked away from the desk, his back straight, his steps measured. He could feel Trent's condescending gaze on his back. He could hear the whispers starting up again in the line. He walked past the marble columns, beneath the glittering chandelier, and out through the heavy glass doors into the afternoon sun. The city noise hit him, a cacophony of traffic and sirens, but it was nothing compared to the roaring in his own head. He walked for a full block before he allowed himself to stop, leaning against the rough brick of an old building to catch his breath. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth. He had known it would be difficult. He had known they would resist. But the public mockery had cut deeper than he'd anticipated. It had been designed to make him feel small. And it had worked. He looked down at the toolbox in his hand. It was dark green, with silver latches tarnished by age and countless hands. The name, H. Jennings, was stenciled in faded white paint on the top. It was more than a box of tools. It was a promise. It was a legacy. It was his father's entire life, condensed into 20 pounds of steel and memory. And inside it, beneath the trays of carefully preserved tools, was the real contract. Not the copies he had shown the boy in the suit, but the original. The one his father had told him to never let out of his sight. Trent Radcliffe thought he was dealing with a confused old man. He thought the papers were just stories. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. Arthur took a deep breath, the city air filling his lungs. The shame was already beginning to recede, replaced by something colder, harder. It was the quiet, unyielding resolve he had inherited from his father. Patience. His father had always said, "Let them think they're smarter. Let them think they've won." The truth has its own weight, Arthur. You just have to wait for the right moment to put it on the scale. The right moment wasn't in a bank lobby, in front of a boy who thought history started the day he was born. The right moment would come. Arthur adjusted his grip on the toolbox. The laughter would stop. He would make sure of it. He started walking again, his steps no longer hesitant, but firm. He wasn't walking away from a defeat. He was walking toward a different kind of conversation. He remembered his father, Henry, sitting at their small kitchen table 50 years ago. The table was covered not with food, but with blueprints and strange, heavy documents. Arthur had been just a boy, but he remembered the gravity in his father's voice, the seriousness in his eyes. Henry Jennings was not a man of many words, but the words he chose were as solid and carefully placed as the bricks he laid. He was a master craftsman, a stonemason and artisan, whose hands had shaped the facades of half the important buildings downtown. His work was his bond. "This building," Henry had said, tapping a thick finger on the architectural drawings for the new Sterling National Bank Tower, "is not just another job, son. This is a monument. Harold Sterling wants it to last for 100 years, and he wants it done right." Harold Sterling was a different kind of man from his descendants. He was a self-made titan who had started with nothing. He respected craftsmen because he was one himself, albeit in the world of finance. He understood that true value was built, not just acquired. He would walk the construction site every day, his expensive shoes covered in dust, talking to the foremen, the welders, the masons. He knew their names. He knew their work. The bank was his legacy project, and the economy at the time was tight. Money was scarce, and skilled labor was demanding a premium. Harold Sterling couldn't afford to pay the top-dollar wages that Henry and his specialized crew of artisans deserved. So, he made them a different kind of offer. An offer built on a promise for the future. Arthur remembered the night his father brought the document home. It wasn't a standard employment contract. It was thick, almost like parchment, with an embossed seal of the bank at the top. His father spread it out on the table with a reverence Arthur had only ever seen him use with his most delicate tools. "He calls it the artisan's endowment," Henry explained, his voice low with a mix of pride and awe. "It's a pension, Arthur, but not a normal one. We take a lower wage now, help him build his monument. In return, he puts a percentage of the bank's foundational stock into a trust for us. It sits there, it grows with the bank. For 50 years. After 50 years, we can claim it, or our children can." His mother, a practical woman who worried about the bills from week to week, had been skeptical. "A promise 50 years away? Henry, we need the money now." But his father had been resolute. He trusted Harold Sterling. More than that, he understood the man's vision. "This isn't just money, Mary. This is a share. A real share. It's a promise sealed in the cornerstone of the building itself. He's making us partners in his legacy." He had pointed to a specific clause, his calloused finger tracing the intricate legal language. "It's ironclad. It's tied to the physical existence of the building and the bank's charter. It can't be dissolved, it can't be bought out, and it can't be written off by future management. It's as permanent as the granite we're setting." To seal this unique contract, Harold Sterling had commissioned a small number of custom-made toolboxes for the master craftsmen on the project. They were a symbolic gift, but they held a practical purpose. Each box contained not only a set of the finest tools, but also a hidden, lead-lined compartment in the base. Inside this compartment, a notarized, sealed original of the artisan's endowment agreement was placed for each man. It was Sterling's way of ensuring the proof would never be lost to a fire or a simple filing error. The proof was to be kept with the tools that had earned it. Arthur's father had cherished that toolbox. It was never just a container for his hammers and chisels. It was a vault. It held the physical manifestation of his life's most important work and the promise that secured his family's future. He cleaned the tools every night, oiled the hinges of the box, and always reminded Arthur of its significance. "Never sell these tools, son," Henry would say, his hand resting on the cool steel lid. "And never, ever lose this box. Everything you need to know is in here. People forget. Papers get lost in filing cabinets. But a craftsman keeps his tools. He keeps his proof." Years passed. Harold Sterling died, and his son took over the bank. The son was a different breed, more interested in leveraged buyouts and corporate rating than in the foundational principles his father had built the empire upon. He saw the bank not as a monument, but as a cash machine. The old ways were discarded. The personal relationships his father had cultivated with employees were replaced with impersonal HR departments and outsourced management firms. Henry Jennings continued to work, but he saw the change. He grew quieter, more watchful. He never spoke of the endowment again, not to anyone at the bank. He knew the new management would see it as a liability, a relic of a bygone era to be swept under the rug. So he kept his silence, worked until he was too old to climb the scaffolding, and then retired to a quiet life. The toolbox sat in his small workshop in the garage, a silent green sentinel guarding a 50-year-old promise. When his father passed away, the toolbox became Arthur's. Arthur had not followed in his father's footsteps. He was a quieter man, a librarian by trade. He respected his father's work, but lacked the hands-on skill. He lived a modest life, surrounded by books and quiet routine. He never married, never had children. He was the sole inheritor of the promise. He knew the 50-year anniversary was approaching. He had marked it on his calendar years ago. When the date finally arrived, he felt a profound sense of duty. This wasn't just about money for him. It was about honor. It was about validating his father's trust and his life's work. It was about proving that some promises were meant to be as enduring as stone. That was the history he had tried to explain to the boy in the suit. That was the weight behind the yellowed papers Trent Radcliffe had laughed at. Arthur sat in his small, tidy apartment, the green toolbox on his coffee table. The laughter from the bank lobby still echoed in his mind, a sharp, ugly counterpoint to his father's quiet, certain words. The truth has its own weight. He opened the latches. The familiar smell of old steel and linseed oil filled the room. The top tray held the tools, each in its proper place. The chisels were still sharp, their wooden handles smooth and dark with age. The small hammer, the calipers, the plumb bob, they were all there, perfectly preserved. They were instruments of creation, of building something solid and true. He lifted the top tray out, then the second. He set them carefully on the floor. The bottom of the box was lined with a thick piece of felt. It looked solid, but his father had shown him the secret, a small, almost invisible seam in the corner. He pressed it, and a section of the floor of the box popped up with a soft click. This was the lead-lined compartment. His father had called it the heart of the box. Inside, nestled in a bed of more felt, was a thick, sealed oilskin pouch. His heart beat a little faster as he lifted it out. His hands, usually so steady from a lifetime of handling fragile books, trembled slightly. This was it. The original document. The one his father had warned him was the key to everything. He had opened it only once before, on the day his father died, just to confirm it was still there. He carefully untied the leather cord and unrolled the pouch. Inside was the document. It was not paper. It was vellum. The ink was a deep, rich black, the script elegant and clear. The embossed seal of Sterling National Bank was crisp and perfect, and at the bottom, 2 signatures. One was his father's, strong and clear, Henry R. Jennings. The other was a bold, authoritative scrawl, Harold J. Sterling. Beside the signatures was the imprint of a notary public, dated and sealed. This was no mere copy. This was the original artifact. But there was more in the pouch. His father had been a meticulous man. Tucked behind the main contract was a small, leather-bound notebook. Arthur had never looked through it before. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with his father's neat, compact handwriting. It was a journal, but not a personal one. It was a work log, detailing every day he had worked on the Sterling Tower. He documented the materials used, the weather conditions, the names of the other men in his crew. But he also documented his conversations with Harold Sterling, dates, times, and direct quotes. He had recorded every promise, every assurance Sterling had given him about the artisan's endowment. June 12th. HS visited the site today. He said, "Henry, this document is my bond. My son may not understand this, but the bank's charter will. It is woven into the legal fabric of the corporation. They can no more ignore it then they can ignore the foundation of this building. September 3rd. Discussed the trust details. HS confirmed the shares are non-dilutable preferred stock, tied directly to the bank's primary asset, the building itself. He called it cornerstone equity. He laughed and said, "Let them try to get rid of you. They'd have to tear the whole damn thing down." Arthur read on, his breath catching in his throat. This was more than a contract. This was a record of intent. It was a chronicle of a promise, witnessed and documented with the precision of a master craftsman. His father had known, even back then, that a day might come when the contract alone wouldn't be enough. He had provided the context, the backstory, the undeniable human element of the agreement. And there was one more thing at the very back of the notebook. A small, folded piece of blueprint paper. Arthur unfolded it. It wasn't a schematic for the building's structure. It was a detail of the cornerstone itself, the massive block of granite laid at the foundation ceremony. There were notations in his father's hand, pointing to a specific spot, and a final entry in the journal explained it. May 5th. The cornerstone was laid today. HS had a small, lead-lined box cast. Inside, he placed a second identical set of the endowment contracts. He had me personally seal it into the cornerstone before it was set. He winked at me and said, "A backup copy, Henry, in case of fire, flood, or fools." Arthur leaned back in his chair, the notebook resting in his lap. He felt a wave of profound respect and love for the father he had lost so long ago. Henry Jennings had not been an educated man in the traditional sense, but his wisdom was deep and practical. He had trusted, but he had also verified. He had accepted a promise, but he had also secured the proof, in triplicate. One copy for the bank's archives, which was likely long gone. One copy in the toolbox, and one copy literally sealed within the foundation of the building itself. The laughter of Trent Radcliffe echoed in his mind again. But this time, it sounded different. It sounded hollow, brittle, the sound of ignorance blissfully unaware of the stone it was about to shatter against. "We deal in real assets here, not stories." Arthur looked from the vellum contract to his father's journal. This was the story, and it was about to become the most real asset Sterling National Bank had ever had to deal with. He knew what he had to do next. This was no longer something he could handle alone, walking into a bank lobby with a folder of papers. This required a different kind of tool, not a hammer, but a lawyer. He thought of George Albright. George was a retired union lawyer, a friend of his father's, a man who had spent 40 years fighting corporations on behalf of working men. He was old now, like Arthur, but his mind was still as sharp as a tack. George would know what to do with this. He would understand the weight of the truth. Arthur closed the toolbox, the click of the latches sounding like the cocking of a rifle. The period of quiet waiting was over. The time for patient action had begun. George Albright lived in a small brick house in a neighborhood that hadn't changed much in 50 years. His office was a converted sunroom, crammed with filing cabinets and overflowing bookshelves. The air smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and righteous indignation. George was a bulldog of a man, with a thick neck, a face like a crumpled road map, and eyes that had seen every trick and loophole in the corporate playbook. He listened to Arthur's story without interruption, his gaze fixed on the green toolbox sitting on his desk. When Arthur finished, George was silent for a long moment. He leaned forward, his elbows on the cluttered desk, and steepled his fingers. He looked at Arthur, then at the box. "He laughed at you?" George finally said, his voice a low rumble. Arthur nodded. "In front of everyone. Called my father's contract a story? A slow, grim smile spread across George's face. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator catching a familiar, welcome scent. Good, he said. Arrogance is a beautiful thing, Arthur. It makes people sloppy. It makes them underestimate men like you and your father. And it makes the fall so much more satisfying. He gestured at the box. Let's see it. Let's see the story. For the next 3 hours, they went through everything. Arthur laid out the vellum contract, the work journal, and the cornerstone blueprint. George read each document with a practiced, meticulous eye. He used a magnifying glass to examine the notary seal on the contract. He read passages from the journal aloud, chuckling grimly at Harold Sterling's prescient warnings. Cornerstone equity? George mused, tapping the journal. I've never heard that term before. Harold Sterling wasn't just a businessman. He was a poet. He literally tied your father's compensation to the foundation of his legacy. A modern lawyer would have a heart attack trying to find a loophole for that. It's too simple, too elegant. He stood up and began to pace the small room, his mind clearly at work. This is not a standard pension claim, Arthur. Thinking of it that way is why the little punk at the desk laughed at you. A pension can be altered, transferred, managed. This is an ownership stake. A dormant one, but ownership nonetheless. That preferred stock he mentioned? If the bank has done as well as I think it has over the last 50 years, the value of that stock, with dividends compounded, it's going to be astronomical. George stopped pacing and looked at Arthur, his eyes sharp. This isn't about getting a few $1,000s in back pay. This is about claiming a foundational share of the entire corporation. They're not going to just hand it over. They're going to fight. They'll call it fraudulent. They'll call your father a liar. They'll try to bury you in legal fees and motions until you give up. Arthur met his gaze without flinching. I won't give up. I know you won't, George said, his grim smile returning. Henry Jennings's son wouldn't, but we have to be smart about this. We don't go back to the loan officer. We don't even go to their in-house legal department. We go straight to the top, to the board of directors, and we don't just ask. We demand. Over the next 2 weeks, George's sunroom became their war room. He made calls, pulling in favors from old colleagues. He hired a forensic accountant, a quiet woman named Sarah, who specialized in untangling complex corporate histories. He also brought in a document expert to authenticate the vellum contract and the ink. The authenticator's report came back first. The vellum, ink, and notary seal were all verified as authentic to the period. The signatures of Henry Jennings and Harold Sterling were confirmed against other known samples from the time. The document was, in his expert opinion, irrefutably genuine. Then Sarah, the accountant, delivered her findings. It had taken her a week of digging through old public records, SEC filings, and archived financial reports. What she found was explosive. The artisan's endowment was not just a forgotten agreement. It had been deliberately buried. It was carried on the books as a liability for the first 10 years, she explained, pointing to a line item in a faded 1980s annual report. It's listed here as Contingent Artisan Compensation Trust. Then, Harold Sterling's son, Richard, took over as CEO. The year after the line item vanishes, it was never paid out, it was never resolved, it was just erased from the books. George slammed his hand on the desk. Criminal, he growled. That's fraud. He knowingly concealed a long-term liability to inflate the bank's value, and every CEO since then has either been ignorant or complicit. Sarah wasn't finished. It gets worse, she said, pushing another folder across the desk. Based on the terms in the contract, a fixed number of preferred shares tied to the bank's foundational assets, I've calculated the current value. The bank has split its stock multiple times since the 1970s. The dividends have been reinvested and compounded for 52 years. She took a deep breath. Mr. Jennings, your father's single share of the endowment, as of the close of the market yesterday, is worth approximately $9.5 million. The room went silent. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. $9.5 million. The number was so large, it was abstract. It didn't feel real. He thought of his small apartment, his modest librarian's salary, the careful budget he lived on. He thought of his father, working in the sun and the cold, his hands raw, taking a lower wage for a promise 50 years in the future. George let out a long, low whistle. And there were what? 5 other master craftsmen on that deal? Sarah nodded. At least, if they or their heirs come forward, the total liability for the bank could be over $50 million. Maybe more. It's enough to trigger a shareholder investigation and get the SEC involved. It's a corporate scandal of the highest order. Arthur looked at the toolbox. It wasn't just a promise anymore. It was a bomb. And they were about to walk it into the heart of Sterling National Bank. George drafted the letter. It was a masterpiece of polite, restrained menace. It was addressed directly to the current CEO, a man named Marcus Sterling, Harold's grandson, and the entire board of directors. It formally stated the claim, referenced the artisan's endowment contract by name, and included the sworn affidavits from the document expert and the forensic accountant. It did not, however, mention the work journal or the cornerstone. George was holding those cards close to his chest. The letter concluded by requesting a formal meeting to discuss the immediate settlement of the claim, stating that if a satisfactory response was not received within 10 business days, they would be forced to pursue all available legal and regulatory channels. They sent it via courier, with a signature required. The 10 days passed in a tense silence. Arthur found it hard to concentrate at work. The quiet aisles of the library, normally his sanctuary, felt like the calm before a storm. He kept thinking of Trent Radcliffe's laughing face. He kept thinking of the number Sarah had quoted. It felt like 2 different worlds, and he was standing with a foot in each, about to be torn apart. On the 9th day, the response came. It was not from a lawyer, but from the office of the Vice President of Lending. It was from Trent Radcliffe. The letter was dismissive and condescending. It acknowledged receipt of their correspondence and stated that after an internal review, the bank had found no record of any such agreement. It called the claim frivolous and without merit. But then came the final provocation. As a gesture of goodwill toward the family of a former contractor, the bank was prepared to offer a one-time final payment of $5,000 to resolve the matter, contingent on the signing of a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. George read the letter and started to laugh. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was a deep, rumbling sound of pure, unadulterated joy. "Oh, you beautiful, arrogant fool," he said, tapping Trent's signature. "He did it. He actually did it." Arthur was confused. "They're just stonewalling us." No, you don't see it," George said, his eyes gleaming. "They could have had their top lawyers handle this quietly. They could have tried to negotiate, but they gave it back to the kid. The CEO, Marcus Sterling, saw the name Jennings, remembered the old man his VP had laughed out of the lobby, and decided to let the boy finish the job. He's trying to swat a fly. He thinks we're bluffing. He thinks a $5,000 check will make the problem go away." George leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This isn't a rejection, Arthur. This is an invitation. They've underestimated us so profoundly, so completely, that they've left the front door wide open. They think they've won. They're sitting in their castle, laughing at us, completely unaware that we've already tunneled under the walls." He picked up the phone. "We're not responding to this letter. We're going to accept their implied invitation for a meeting. But not on their terms, on ours. George's counteroffer was a work of art. He replied directly to Marcus Sterling, copying the entire board. He politely declined the insulting and disingenuous offer of $5,000. He stated that since Mr. Radcliffe seemed to be the bank's designated point person on this matter, they would be happy to meet with him to present their evidence in full. However, given the seriousness of the claim and the potential for regulatory oversight, they insisted the meeting be attended by Mr. Sterling himself, as well as the bank's chief legal counsel. He gave them a date and time, 1 week away. "Let's see if the CEO has the guts to show up to the mess he let his lapdog create," George had said as he sealed the envelope. The bank agreed. The hubris was astonishing. They clearly believed they could intimidate an old man and his small-time lawyer in a boardroom setting. They had no idea what was coming. They thought the story was just the single piece of vellum. They were walking into the trap with smiles on their faces. The day of the meeting, Arthur wore his best suit. It was old, but well-maintained. He stood in front of the mirror and straightened his tie, his father's quiet face looking back at him from his own reflection. He felt a calm settle over him. The fear and humiliation were gone, burned away by the cold fire of purpose. He picked up the green toolbox. It felt lighter today, as if eager to be opened, to finally tell its story. The Sterling National Bank Tower loomed over the city, a monument of glass and steel. It was far more modern and impersonal than the original granite building his father had helped create next door. They were ushered up to the top floor, to the executive boardroom. The room was designed to intimidate. A massive mahogany table, leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city spreading out below. It was a room that screamed power and money. Marcus Sterling, the CEO, sat at the head of the table. He had the same arrogant air as Trent, but it was coated with a thin veneer of corporate polish. He was handsome, silver-haired, and looked like he was born in a suit. Next to him was the bank's chief counsel, a severe-looking woman named Eleanor Vance. And sitting at Sterling's right hand, looking smug and triumphant, was Trent Radcliffe. He gave Arthur a small, condescending nod, as if greeting a peasant who had wandered into the king's court. George and Arthur took their seats opposite them. Arthur placed the toolbox on the floor beside his chair. Trent eyed it with a smirk. Marcus Sterling began, his voice smooth and controlled. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. I believe we can resolve this matter quickly. We have reviewed your claim, and as Mr. Radcliffe has already informed you, we find no basis for it. The bank has no record of this artisan's endowment. While we appreciate your creative approach, the fact remains that this is a baseless claim." George smiled politely. "Mr. Sterling, with all due respect, the absence of your records does not constitute an absence of fact. It merely points to a failure in your institution's bookkeeping." Eleanor Vance, the lawyer, spoke for the first time, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Albright, this is a waste of our time. You have a document of questionable provenance and no supporting evidence. The bank's position is firm. The $5,000 nuisance offer is still on the table. Take it, or we will see you in court, and I assure you, we will counterclaim for frivolous litigation and seek to have you sanctioned." It was the moment George had been waiting for. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of relaxation. "Questionable provenance? No supporting evidence? That's where you are mistaken." He looked at Arthur and nodded. Arthur reached down and lifted the toolbox, placing it on the magnificent mahogany table with a solid, resonant thud. The sound seemed to startle them. It was a plain, working-class object in a world of polished surfaces and abstract finance. It didn't belong here. Trent Radcliffe couldn't help himself. He let out a small, derisive snort. "What's this? Bringing your work tools? Sir, This isn't a repair job. We deal in real assets, not sentimental junk. It was the phrase, the callback. George's eyes lit up. Arthur felt a surge of cold clarity. He looked directly at Trent, his voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the boy's sneering tone. You are correct, Mr. Radcliffe. This is not sentimental junk. This is the evidence. He opened the latches. The click echoed in the silent room. He did not take out the tools. He lifted out the trays and set them aside. He reached into the hidden compartment and drew out the oilskin pouch. He carefully unrolled the vellum contract and placed it in the center of the table. This is the original contract, Arthur said. Not a copy. We have had it authenticated. The vellum, the ink, the notary seal, and the signatures of both my father and your grandfather, Mr. Sterling, are genuine. We have a sworn affidavit from the expert, which we will get to in a moment. Eleanor Vance leaned forward to look at it, her professional skepticism warring with a flicker of unease. Sterling glanced at it and waved a dismissive hand. A piece of paper. It proves nothing. On its own, perhaps you could argue that, George said smoothly. He looked at Arthur again. Arthur reached back into the box and brought out his father's leather-bound journal. He opened it to the first page and slid it across the table to Vance. This, Arthur said, is my father's work journal, kept contemporaneously during the construction of the original bank building. In it, he details numerous conversations with your grandfather, Mr. Sterling. Conversations where Harold Sterling repeatedly confirms the nature and intent of the artisan's endowment. He refers to it as cornerstone equity. He explains that it is woven into the bank's very charter and cannot be dissolved. Vance began to read, her eyes narrowing. Sterling's polished composure began to crack. He looked at Trent, as if expecting him to do something, but the young man was staring at the journal, his smirk finally gone, replaced by a look of dawning confusion. A personal diary? Sterling scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It's hearsay, inadmissible. Perhaps, George conceded pleasantly. But it makes for a very compelling story for a jury, or for the Securities and Exchange Commission, especially this part. He had Arthur turn to the back of the journal, to the entry about the cornerstone, and slid it in front of Sterling. Sterling read the entry. His face went pale. The mention of a second identical contract sealed within the cornerstone of the building seemed to land like a physical blow. He looked from the journal to Arthur, a new, desperate light in his eyes. This is absurd, he stammered. A fantasy. Is it? Arthur asked, his voice still quiet, but now it carried the weight of the room. Your grandfather was a meticulous man, Mr. Sterling, just like my father. He believed in building things to last. He believed in redundancy. He put a backup copy of the promise inside the very foundation of his legacy. There was a heavy silence in the room. The panoramic view of the city seemed to mock the crumbling confidence of the men who were supposed to be its masters. Eleanor Vance was still reading the journal, her face a mask of grim concentration. She knew what this meant. A contemporaneous record, combined with a genuine contract and the physical claim of a second contract hidden in the building itself. Their case was collapsing. But Trent Radcliffe, full of the blind arrogance of youth, decided to make one last stand. He was the one who had started this, and his reputation was on the line. This is a shakedown, he said, his voice rising, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur. You can't prove any of this. You think we're going to go jackhammering our own building because of some scribbles in an old notebook? You have nothing. George held up a hand, a placating gesture that was anything but. Now, Mr. Radcliffe, no need for theatrics. We don't need a jackhammer. You see, we did a little more research. He pulled a final document from his briefcase. It was a modern city planning document. The city is installing new fiber optic cables along this entire street next month, George said calmly. To do so, they require temporary access to the utility conduits that run directly through the foundation of the original Sterling Bank building. In fact, their survey shows they will need to remove a small access panel located less than 5 feet from the cornerstone's position. He slid the survey across the table. We have already filed a motion with the court to have a certified inspector present during that municipal work, to verify the contents of the cornerstone. A judge has already signed off on it, given the evidence we've presented. Checkmate. The room fell into a profound, suffocating silence. It was no longer the silence of a boardroom, but the silence of a tomb. The weight of 52 years of history, of a promise made and a promise broken, descended upon them all. Marcus Sterling stared at the city survey, his face the color of ash. He looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of his grandfather rise up to condemn him. Eleanor Vance slowly closed the journal and pushed it back across the table. Her face was devoid of expression. It was the face of a lawyer who knew the fight was over before it had even begun. And Trent Radcliffe. He just sat there, his mouth slightly open, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization of what he had done. He had laughed at the tip of an iceberg, and in his arrogance, he had steered the entire bank directly into its path. The smirk was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy look of pure terror. He had built his entire fledgling career on being the sharpest, most ruthless young man in the room. Now, in this silent, terrible moment, he was just a boy who had been given a gun and had promptly shot his own side in the foot. The silence stretched on, heavier than any words. It was filled with the dawning comprehension of ruin. The $9.5 million for Arthur was just the beginning. There were the other craftsmen, the decades of fraud and concealment, the SEC investigation, the shareholder lawsuits, the public scandal. It was a corporate apocalypse, and it had all been unleashed by the simple, arrogant act of laughing at an old man. Finally, Marcus Sterling spoke, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, all the polish and power gone. He wasn't speaking to his lawyer or to Trent. He was speaking to Arthur, as if he were the only other person in the room. "What do you want?" Arthur looked at the CEO, a man who had inherited a legacy and squandered its soul. He felt no triumph, no desire for vengeance, just a quiet, sad sense of finality. He thought of his father's hands, calloused and strong. He thought of his trust in a promise. He leaned forward, his own voice quiet but clear, cutting through the thick silence. "I want what my father was owed. I want the promise honored." He paused, then added, looking from Sterling to the shattered figure of Trent Radcliffe. "And I want you to remember that some things, some assets, don't show up on a balance sheet until it's far, far too late." The meeting was over. The war had been won. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Before Arthur and George had even reached the lobby, the sound of shouting could be heard from the boardroom. Marcus Sterling, in a desperate act of self-preservation, fired Trent Radcliffe on the spot. The security guards who escorted Trent from the building said he was white-faced and trembling, clutching a small cardboard box with the contents of his desk, his brass nameplate clattering inside. He was the first casualty, the sacrificial lamb offered up to appease the coming storm. But it wasn't enough. George's carefully worded leaks to the financial press, timed to coincide with the court-ordered inspection of the cornerstone, turned the situation into a media firestorm. The story was irresistible. A forgotten 50-year-old promise, a humble librarian, a powerful bank, and a secret hidden in the foundation. When the inspector, under the watchful eye of news cameras, confirmed the existence of the lead box and the identical vellum contracts inside. The bank's fate was sealed. Sterling National Bank's stock plummeted. The SEC launched a full-scale investigation into decades of fraudulent accounting. The board of directors, facing shareholder revolts and personal liability, forced Marcus Sterling to resign in disgrace. His golden parachute was rescinded, and he soon found himself the primary target of a federal indictment. Eleanor Vance, in a desperate attempt to save herself, turned state's evidence, providing prosecutors with years of internal memos and emails that proved Sterling and his father before him had known about the endowment and had actively conspired to conceal it. Arthur, meanwhile, was insulated from the chaos. George handled the settlement negotiations. The bank, now under new emergency management, was eager to stop the bleeding. They didn't even quibble. They paid out the full $9.5 million to Arthur, and they set up a $50 million fund to find and compensate the heirs of the other 5 craftsmen. The story of the artisan's endowment became a legend in the financial world, a cautionary tale about arrogance and the enduring power of a promise. One afternoon, a month after the settlement, Arthur was back in his apartment, packing books into boxes. The apartment felt too small now, not for his possessions, but for his future. With the money came a new sense of possibility, but also a profound responsibility. He found a letter he had tucked away years ago, a letter his father had left for him inside the toolbox, to be read only after the endowment was settled. He sat and read it. It was not about the money. It was about the principle. Arthur, his father had written in his strong, steady hand. If you are reading this, it means you have seen the promise through. Do not let the money change the man you are. It is not a prize, it is a tool. Use it to build something good, something that lasts. Honor the work of honest hands. That is the only legacy that matters. Arthur knew what he had to do. He didn't buy a mansion or a sports car. He bought an old, abandoned warehouse in the industrial part of town, the kind of brick building his father would have admired. He used the money to establish the Jennings Foundation for the Skilled Trades. Its mission was simple: to provide scholarships, apprenticeships, and tools for young people who wanted to learn a craft, to become masons, carpenters, welders, and artisans. He wanted to ensure that the value of working with one's hands was never forgotten, never laughed at. He hired a small staff to run the foundation and spent his own days in the workshop he had built inside the warehouse. It was a larger version of his father's garage workshop, filled with the best tools, the scent of sawdust and machine oil in the air. He wasn't a master craftsman like his father, but he found a quiet joy in learning, in shaping wood and metal, in creating something real and solid. The green toolbox sat on a special workbench in the center of the shop, a constant reminder of where he had come from. A year later, the foundation was thriving. The first class of apprentices was hard at work, their futures bright. The news covered the story, not as a financial scandal anymore, but as a story of redemption and hope. Arthur became a quiet, respected figure in the city, known for his generosity and his unwavering integrity. One day, a woman came to the foundation. Her name was Clara. She was an architect who specialized in historical preservation. She had read about Arthur and his father and wanted to see the work they were doing. She was kind, intelligent, and had a warm, genuine smile. She wasn't impressed by his wealth. She was impressed by his purpose. She saw the value not in the 9-figure bank account, but in the calluses starting to form on his hands. They started talking. They found they shared a love for old buildings, for stories, and for things built to last. They started having dinner, then spending weekends together, walking through the city and admiring the handiwork of generations past. For the first time in his life, Arthur felt a sense of complete peace. He was honoring his father's legacy, building a future for others, and sharing his life with someone who understood him completely. He sometimes wondered what had become of the men who had scorned him. A quick search online told him all he needed to know. Marcus Sterling was serving a 7-year sentence in a federal prison for securities fraud. His family's name, once a symbol of power, was now synonymous with disgrace. And Trent Radcliffe? His fall had been just as complete, though less dramatic. Blacklisted from the financial industry, his name a punchline on trading floors, he was last seen working as a shift manager at a big-box electronics store, his expensive suits replaced by a cheap polyester polo shirt. Arthur felt a brief, fleeting pang of something that might have been pity, but it passed. Trent had been given a choice, and he had chosen arrogance. He was living with the consequences. One sunny afternoon, Arthur was in his workshop, sanding a piece of oak, when Clara came in. She brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him, watching his hands work. "You look happy here," she said softly. Arthur switched off the sander and wiped his brow. He looked around the workshop, at the young apprentices learning their craft in the next room, at the green toolbox sitting proudly on its bench, and at the kind, loving face of the woman beside him. He thought of the journey that had brought him to this moment, the quiet years of waiting, the stinging humiliation in the bank, the cold resolve, and the final, silent victory. His father had been right. The money was just a tool. This, the purpose, the love, the peace, this was the real endowment. He had finally claimed his father's true inheritance. He smiled, a genuine contented smile that reached his eyes. "I am," he said. "I'm finally home." He was no longer just the keeper of a promise. He was living it. He had learned that the deepest knowledge is not always the most complex. Sometimes it is simply the truth, held patiently for the right moment. And he understood, with a certainty as solid as the granite his father had once laid, that you must never let anyone else tell you what your own history is worth. You must trust what you know, protect the old proof, and understand that some promises are built to outlast the foolishness of men who try to forget them. He was living the life he had truly earned, a life built not on a balance sheet, but on a foundation of honor,